Amico, page 187. Of course I was surprised to hear from him that second time, given how he'd left our initial interview. In something of an old man's huff, I thought. I didn't usually make trips like the one he was proposing, but after 2 days I came to the conclusion that I might find something unknown in his life that might prove interesting. It was muggy and claustrophobic the day he came to my house in Park Slope. I knew he was apprehensive about being shown in a bad light. He'd said as much to me the day before at Fayweather Hall, where I'd caught up with him. He was worried he was being positioned for something that, if manipulated just right on film, might expose him as the villain he most likely thought I considered him to be. He'd sat on my couch in the living room facing the window that looked out over the street. I'd asked him if he didn't mind taking off his shoes, explaining that I knew this wasn't a very polite thing to ask a guest, but that I had someone living in the basement apartment and the hardwood floors amplified the sound. He crossed his feet at the ankles, and I noticed his big right toe stretched out nervously. "First, you get to interview me," I said. "That makes sense to me." So I answered his questions about myself, where I first began making short films and why, what schools I'd gone to, the usual CV sort of thing. I suspected he knew something about me to begin with. This was not my first project in the field, and I imagined he would have been familiar with some of my work. We, the two of us, occupied opposite ends of the same spectrum. I was surprised when he professed to know nothing about me. I elaborated on my particular interest in this project. I stressed the point that this was not a personal rampage. A professional documentary filmmaker, I would not cloud my work with my own stories, which, such as they were of interest to no one but myself. I explained my vow never to stoop to confessional ranting, and he seemed to listen to me intently. "Of course," I said, "that doesn't mean I just walk away from this history. It is a history that will always fascinate me. It's my subject, and I can never imagine another as important or as definitive of who we are. The difference is that I don't turn the camera on myself. That's all." I went on for a time like this, then showed him a couple examples of my work. He watched in silence until the 2 short films were over. "I'm not saying you'll make or break the idea," I said. "I've interviewed more than 50 people over the last 6 years. I've hundreds of tapes stored A to Z. I have 7 more people lined up in the next few days." "Mostly survivors?" "No. I have Eduardo Elder, Pierre Brody, Vannevar Bush. I also have average Americans remembering what they were doing when they heard the news. A couple of kids who never even heard of Hiroshima. I can't imagine you're not going to push it in a certain direction. I say that with respect. And that's your right, too. But I mean slant it in a direction that suits your purpose. Editorialize, even proselytize. Everyone's got a message, right? This is a document I'm building. It's a collage, but I understand what you're getting at." "Maybe I'm not precisely the best person for this," he said. Was this more confession than humility, I wondered, or the other way around, or simply a moment of fear? I noticed his right toe began to bob then. "I think I've scared you with the idea of a last act." "Sorry?" he said. "You don't want to make any final declarations. That's my guess. Reluctance to stick your neck out. It's not all that unusual. Sorry, it's not an accusation, just a fact." "How long have you been here?" "Remember what I said, Professor Bowl. I will not turn the camera on myself. That's my only rule. What matters in this project is your interest here. Ultimately, like I said, you won't make or break what I'm doing. I thought your point of view might interest some. I saw immediately that I'd upset him. He unlocked his hands and prepared to raise himself to leave. It looked like I'd lost him. So I had no reason not to continue. He was going anyway. You know it's true, I said. You must know your research position could have been filled by any one of 24 other scientists in the time it took to get a plane out of Chicago or New York. You are a footnote. You must know that, which in some ways you must be thankful for. It must lessen the guilt. Enough, he said, enough. Being there in whatever capacity, though, I continued, is probably enough to keep you awake at night. Am I right? He turned in a fury and began towards the door. I almost felt sorry for him. He seemed ridiculous and pathetic, simply an old man in stocking feet. Then he stopped and turned. You are a surprising woman, he said. I didn't know what to expect when it came time to finally meet. I thought I might like you, but I see you are a fish in a glass bowl with only one view of the world around you. That is what I can see in you. You are no different, and that is a shame. I expected more. I had hoped for more. I will tell you what frightens me. What frightens me is the thought of what would have happened had we not succeeded. What would have happened if we failed? That is what keeps me up at night. I rented a car at international arrivals and drove to his home in that small town 3/4 of an hour east of Toronto, where he lived with his wife Sophie. He met me in his driveway and came to the side of the car. Trouble finding the place? He asked, pulling open the door for me. It's an easy flight, isn't it? It was easy enough, I said. You can hardly call it traveling, I stepped out. You must have flown it 100 times. Let me help with this. It's not much, I said. He stepped back, and I reached across the seat and took the single equipment bag, which contained my video camera and blank cassettes, and swung the door closed. I was glad he hadn't offered to pick me up. This way I was not beholden. I could leave whenever I wanted to, which I planned to do the following day. The fewer niceties, the better. My luggage stayed in the car, because I'd be sleeping at a roadside hotel I'd passed on the way here. I'd brought only one change of clothes with me, and my return flight was booked for the following evening. He led me into his study on the main floor, whose walls were covered with books and maps and an old print of a labyrinth garden somewhere in England, I guessed. There was an old Bell and Howell projector sitting in a corner of the study on a small stand, dust patches spotting its gray cast iron surface. He touched his finger to the stack of film reels that sat on his desk. Straight to it, then, he said. I made these while I was in Hiroshima, October of 1945, late September. I'd brought a camera from a serviceman, a 16mm Paillard Bolex, a good little handheld model. I doubt they make them any more. I could hide it easily enough, which I was obliged to do occasionally. I got these out without anyone knowing. I remember a group of Japanese filmmakers were thrown in jail for doing the same. He checked to see if the projector was plugged in, drew the curtain, and turned the machine on. He pulled the screen down by a cord which hung from a canister placed horizontally a foot shy of the ceiling, and the white box of light established itself squarely in the middle of the wall. I'd already looked at hundreds of hours of Hiroshima tapes, always edited, censored by some military board in some forgotten New Mexico outpost or some such place. I knew how the sanitized version went. It was meant to be consumed in classrooms and public libraries across the land. Nothing nearly as hideous as I'd known it, graceful in its platitudes to the suffering of the Japanese people, but still unrepentant. This was war, after all. Remember Pearl Harbor? Some of these films showed brief shots of the destroyed city, some bandaged children receiving medical treatment from American doctors, and food supplies from international organizations. Normally they didn't mention, much less focus on, the festering wounds, the destroyed families, the orphans. But at the very least, what he was about to show me might prove to be a unique point of view, I thought. I didn't expect great things. I hadn't come all that way for someone else's documentary. But as I watched the people on the screen, it became clear quickly enough that this first reel might be a document not to be entirely disregarded, although aesthetically, of course, it bore many of the beginner's trademarks. The images came in jerks and clumsy bounces, sloppy home movie style, sometimes a 45-degree slant, sometimes just a foot walking, just plain ground and someone's mud-splattered army-issue boot crunching gravel. Then a line of faces, moon-eyed and empty, staring up from their hospital beds, so familiar to me. I wondered for a moment if I would see myself or my brother lying there in one of those beds, or my grandfather shuffling up the aisle. I felt myself stiffening, preparing for an assault. But I did not see those memories in his films. What I did see was raw and completely unedited. These film reels did not carry any sound. That's why the films, as he played one after another, began to seem important. They were dirty, harsh, and completely true. "How long after the bomb is this?" I asked. "October, you said?" "3 weeks or so, maybe late September. I was there a month and a half. I have dozens of these. Each one's just a few minutes long. I don't know how many I've lost. I think quite a few. They didn't store very well. Some are in pretty rough condition, probably totally destroyed, but I have reels from all over. Others I haven't even bothered to develop." I didn't speak. For a time I just sat watching, enthralled and horrified in equal measure. I carried them around like family portraits in a way. I didn't say a word. My excitement was growing. I could do something with these. I'd come hoping that some unknown history would pop out of his gentlemanly exterior, the proper old European, that I might discover something about myself in this strange old man. And suddenly all this was coming to me in the hyper-real color that put heat and light into the objects and people they focused on. They all seemed to run a millisecond too fast, in the fashion of earlier film. A man on screen walked through the ash garden of the city with the approximate gallop of a Charlie Chaplin film. It was like watching the past trying to catch up with the present. Most of the reels stopped and started in the middle of things, broke away, went blank. Some sputtered and jammed. There were no scenes, no secrets given away, no narrative, just a day walking through the city, charred and anonymous. It looked precisely as I'd remembered it, the film clicking there before me. There were makeshift hospitals, and a man squatting in the ruins with his pants at his ankles, half a minute of 2 well-dressed officers of the conquering army striding down the middle of the street, and an American with a Japanese girl on his arm and a bottle of liquor standing at a street corner in Tokyo's Omori district, maybe having a fine time, the sign over their heads shouting out, "Dance, dance, dance," in flashing red. No one knows about these? These have been out in the shed since we came here. You haven't looked at them since when? Only only once in a while, at least since we left New York 15 years. Seeing you reminded me." He stopped himself. "I wanted to put them to good use. I never knew how. There's other stuff, too. I went to Palomar's in the 60s when the 4 bombs got dropped by accident, mid-flight refueling. I was interested in documenting certain things. I wasn't as organized as you are. I read about it in the papers. One plane clipped another, and they both went down. I got over there as fast as I could. I doubt if anyone else got that on film. Franco and the Americans kept it relatively unknown. I've got pictures of army dump trucks carting away radioactive Spanish soil. Then I followed it to North Carolina, where they dumped it. I used to try to track down accidents, cases of nuclear negligence. I was trying to do something for the new school, develop a course, but I never finished with it. That's when I taught myself how to develop this stuff. I didn't want anyone to know what I was up to till it was all down. I've been carrying it around ever since, but I never have made anything out of it. Now it's just wasting away in those undeveloped reels. When I told him I could do that for him, restore the damaged reels and develop the rest, he said they were a sort of diary to him. Very personal, he said. He wasn't sure he wanted just to pass them over to me. He'd have a look at them, see what they were. Then he would decide. He drew back the curtain when we were through, revealing the lake, and raised the screen. I blinked in the light glaring off the water. Sophie, his wife, standing in the yard amid a cluster of creeping rose and lilac bushes, turned to the window and smiled. He took me outside and introduced us. She was dressed in work clothes, a gardener's hat and gloves, totally protected from the sun. She didn't seem surprised to find me there. I assumed he'd told her that they were going to have a visitor. She looked fragile and pale, although it had been a bright and hot summer in New York at least, but she seemed comfortable too in those old baggy work clothes. "I hope you had a nice trip," she said. I told her that I had, that I was glad to be here. We were standing in the middle of a marvelous garden filled with bushes and hedges cut into strange animal shapes. "What do you think of my husband's work?" she said. "He's very pleased to have you here, you know. He needs us more than he knows. He tried to get me interested in his studies. It might help with my project," I said. "I've never wanted to look at them, those films, myself. I don't understand the fascination. That was a terrible time." Anton managed a smile and asked if we'd like something to drink, then turned back to the house to prepare something. His wife led me down to the edge of the property, where the grass ended and the loose stone and driftwood began. To the left, 2 piers jutted out into the lake. The closer was old and broken into 3 sections. The other, new-looking. One had a white and red lighthouse at its end. Sophie was not much older than I was, I guessed, 10 years or so, but I found myself deferring to her in a way that had once been second nature to me. Beneath her hat she wore her gray hair in a ponytail, which fell down her back between her shoulder blades. She seemed aged beyond her years, and after a few minutes I began to suspect her skin was partially translucent. I had noticed the absence of color immediately, but now it seemed much more than that. Despite the wide-brimmed hat, I could see a lone vein, blue and bulging, on the right side of her forehead. A network of fibrous red membrane spread out beneath her eyes and cheekbones. It occurred to me then that this woman was ill, and instead of playing the gardener or partial host, should be resting in bed, if not a hospital. You live over there, she said, pointing with a mixed degree of pleasure and strain. New York is over there a good distance now, mind you, and to the east some, but it's there. You would know we lived there for many years. Did Anton tell you that? Yes, I said, your husband told me. She nodded, distracted, it seemed, by the work still at hand. This is all really marvelous, I said. She was bending over a rose bush. I watched her pull out her hand, shaking slightly, and wait for a ladybug to crawl up onto her index finger. Once abroad, it crawled over her skin in its blind, stupid searching. Then she raised her hand to her mouth and blew it into the air. You can't imagine the things that make their home here, she said. There's all sorts of life. We continued along a path parallel to the lake shore till we reached an arbor at the bottom of the property. Its wood frame was lightly stained. Cedar, I guessed, wildly, and draped in a flowering riot of, as she explained, pointing, iris, and meadow rue, and New England asters. Underneath was a small statue, a cheap Greek plagiarism of a naked boy tilting a canister of water over a fish's mouth. As I was led along its southern edge, I was struck by the size and complexity of the garden. Animal shapes were cut into the plants and trees, like in the print I'd noticed in the old professor's office, but many of these had overgrown their edges. I could still gather from the rough outlines what they were meant to represent. Foxes with large tails and open-winged birds, and what looked like leaping schools of fish. Sophie kneeled slowly and plucked some weeds, and we started up again along the path. It never ends, though, she said, stuffing the cluster of leaves into a pants pocket. I'm afraid at this age it's a losing battle, my dear. The tall grass and beach sand and rocks were to our right, and a large piece of driftwood, nearly an entire tree, brought in by some storm. Her husband found us there and delivered 3 glasses of lemonade, which we drank as we mutely admired the sailboats pulling their white hulls through the dark water. After Bull excused himself just after 1 o'clock that afternoon to tend to some pressing concern, he said, Sophie led me downtown at her snail's pace to show me around. By now I was convinced that she was quite ill, though of course I was in no position to ask about her condition. Her body seemed to be slipping away from her. Physically, I could tell she was straining, even walking as slowly as this, but when she asked if I would like anything special for supper, or if there were certain things I couldn't eat, and I told her I hadn't planned on staying, she smiled radiantly and said, "Well, then, we'll just have to get something good enough to change your mind." The town was quite small, easily small enough that I would stand out. I wondered for a moment what nicknames I might have been given if I'd grown up here. Everyone I saw that afternoon was white. There were 2 banks I counted on our brief walk, some tourist shops, a few dozen family businesses, stationery and the like, and a small cafe called Swiss Canadian Bakery. In one store's window were hung a dozen or so dream catchers, 2 dark cherry wood canoe paddles, and a family of Indian dolls. We were trailing a grocery cart behind us, the 2-wheeled kind lined with a blue sackcloth to prevent smaller items from slipping through the mesh. People in summer shorts and cotton dresses and sandals crisscrossed the nearly carless street, licking at ice cream cones from behind sunglasses. Only occasionally did I feel a pair of eyes following me, head slowly rotating with my progress as I walked alongside this odd woman, who surely was familiar here. Of course, I knew what it felt like to stick out in a crowd, to be different, but I hadn't been stared at since my childhood. It was my skin, obviously, though these people might not have known what it was that attracted their curiosity. They couldn't recognize in the shimmering light that reflected off these shop windows that other worldly sheen on my grafted skin. There was only the hint of scarring left, barely noticeable, but I was never sure what impact it had on people. Nor did it help that the town was as white as it was, as aggressively uniform, and it seemed of a single mind. This was something I remembered from my first years away from home, the destructive self-consciousness that followed me around before I was able to teach myself to close my eyes to it, before I knew what sort of person preyed on the hopeful and vulnerable girl I used to be. Actually, I was planning to speak with your husband about this, the reason I came. I liked those films he showed me, but in fact I'd like to ask him some questions, but I didn't get the chance. He just disappeared after you showed me your work in the garden. He likes to keep busy. Usually he doesn't trust people like you, she said. She was to be admired for her honesty, anyway. I gave her that. He's afraid of getting his words twisted. I'd consider this quite an honor. I gave her my promise not to twist his words. You must put his mind at ease, dear. He worries about the future. He thinks about the way the world is going. Oh no, he'd never say as much. You don't expect him that from his type of man, being a scientist, all progress and onwards and upwards and so forth. That's how they think, you know. But he is so very ethical. That's not a word we hear very often these days. Are you married, dear? I shook my head. Well, a woman will know regardless. Most men aren't hard to figure out. Not when they want something of you. She paused and touched my shoulder to lead me into a fruit and vegetable store. My husband is not typical in that way. He does not give secrets away very easily. It was cooler inside, a garden of fresh produce, but I was no happier with the progress I was making here. I waited for her to select what she needed, careful not to distract her attention for fear that this shopping expedition would drag out even longer. I had come a long way and was becoming increasingly agitated. This was time wasted. I couldn't deny her sweet interest and honesty and the importance and sense of mystery her husband still seemed to hold for her. But, though admirable, that was not the reason I'd come. She seemed the type of woman who might take in stray dogs or pass her days mending a bird's broken wing. What I wanted was to get to the man himself, then be gone. I'd taken vacation time from work, and when this work was done had plans to meet up with two friends, translators from the UN who'd flown in on ahead of me to a small fishing village in Washington State near Port Angeles, where we would stay at a small cabin overlooking the Pacific. She introduced me to the cashier, who offered her hand across the counter. A friend of my husband's, Sophie explained, and I tried to smile.